Good evening. This week, Colonel Markus Reisner of the Austrian Armed Forces gave us another update here on YouTube about the current situation in the Ukraine. And this is the topic of tonight's video. I do not want to get into any other video or any other topic tonight than just that. And there's just some thoughts I wanted to share with you. To summarize this, what Colonel Reisner said there in his video was basically that at this point, the Russian armed forces have destroyed approximately 85% of the infrastructure necessary to maintain the electric grid and heating related, infrastructure for heat in the Ukraine. And that is pretty bad if you think about it for the civilian population in the Ukraine, looking at the fact that it is getting cold now and the winter is coming. On the battlefield news, so to speak, I have been watching that separately on the deep state map, is the occupied area in Russia, the Ukrainian occupied territory in Russia, has lost some territory to the Russians on the northern flank of their area there. They had occupied in Kursk. I do not know how heavy the losses are, but there's pretty intense fighting there going on too. And then the other part is then in the central region there, further down southwest or southwest. I forgot now the name of the town, but they had been battling there for a while, and the Russian army was able to take control of some area. We're not talking huge, gains here again, if it comes to territory, but it is, they have advanced here and the Ukrainians have lost some of the stuff here. And on the other hand is what Colonel Reisner pointed out demonstrated is the different drone technologies the Ukraine has developed, which is very interesting. It's a very new type of warfare. And the Ukraine at this point is probably the most advanced country from a military point of view, military strategy, warfare strategy, in deploying all sorts of different types of drones. And the countermeasures the Russians have come up with the electromagnetic field creation to disturb these drones, and then the response of the Ukrainians by using drones which are wire-controlled rather than remote-controlled wireless. And so this is highly interesting to see. And this is actually the topic I wanted to pick up from. President Zelensky has presented a 5-point plan, I believe. I have not listened to the plan. I have to say this, I haven't had a chance yet to fully catch up with everything what happened this week. But here are some of my thoughts based on this, what has happened now, almost over 1,000 days of war now, and I had pointed that out over the last 2.5 years in my videos, with the lack of a industrial military complex in the Ukraine itself because of the preceding years and how the Ukraine came about and this, that, and the other thing. So I want to pick up here at the time when we still had the Soviet Union. Because in the 1980s, especially in the later part of the mid-80s to late 80s, I was heavily involved in the security aspect in Europe, in Western Europe with NATO. And so I had a pretty good understanding of the industrial military complex in the old Soviet Union at this time. And we understood very well that this whole industrial complex they had set up over the decades after World War II the Korean War, and then the, supply of weapons and material to Vietnam, to North Vietnam, and then the Afghanistan war they had been fighting in the late 70s till the 80s. It developed in that sense that they had a great advantage in terms of steel production. Now, when you just start talking steel, the country has to have natural resources. So that's one is coal. You need coal to make steel for the smelting process, and then to turn the iron basically into steel with carbon in it, which makes the steel. And they had gotten that part pretty much under full development, and the Soviet Union also had a lot of aluminum. And with the building of nuclear reactors, Chernobyl was one of them. They had many others, that was already a decision made. They had plenty of electric energy available to actually produce aluminum on a large scale. All of this was focused on military production. The Soviet Union lacked the ability to produce integrated circuits, microcontrollers, for instance. The West, say like by 1985, we were probably between Intel, IBM, Siemens, Thomson brand in France, and a couple Japanese semiconductor manufacturers at that time, probably 10 to 15 years ahead with our technology in producing advanced microcontrollers. And not only that, but we were also able to produce microcontrollers and memory chips, RAM, ROM, EPROMs, which could be used in space. So they're radiation hardened. That's what we call that basically. And we had a great advantage in that technology, and that still is we're still pretty much leading in that area. In the 1990s, we also added then FPGAs. These are free programmable gate arrays, which are similar to microcontrollers, but they can do a lot more and a lot faster. And of course, we have now the advanced chips for AI, these graphic processors and math coprocessors and all of that stuff. So we had the advantage here. However, a lot of the aircraft manufacturing in the Soviet Union happened in the Ukraine because it was still part of the Soviet Union. So a lot of the stuff was centered in and around Kiev and in other parts of the Ukraine, where those various aircraft and missile parts and missile systems were actually built. Now, knowing this, and we know that after the decline of the Soviet Union and the separation of several states out of it, is that the industrial military complex sort of went into a state of sleep, kind of a Dornröschen schlaf, I forgot now what that fairy tale is called in English, but it is that gal who fell asleep for 100 years, if you remember that, and then she wakes up. So this is sort of what happened here. Now, the war started with Russia, between the Ukraine and Russia, really in 2014, when the Russian army was supporting the separatists over there in the Donbas region, and when Crimea was occupied. The political leadership at that point in the Ukraine would have had the opportunity to quietly regather all of these scientists and machinists, the whole personnel out of this former apparatus of the Soviet Union, that industrial military complex, and revived, especially the missile technologies they had in these companies or in these areas, because a lot of the scientists, the engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, scientists, all sorts of backgrounds. And of course, all the skilled laborers, the machinists, the welders, all of that stuff was still there. I mean, they were 10 years younger than what they are today. And some of them may have just barely retired, and some of them were probably not retired. But the resources, the human resources, were there. And at that point, they could have, which they probably did to a certain extent, restart or start their own missile program. I guess they did this to a certain extent, but it happened a lot later, and it happened with quite some lack in it. And this is the part which I have never really understood, and I don't think I have fully addressed that in my other videos over the last 2.5 years. But this is something which has really caused me some thinking, on why wouldn't they done that earlier? Building up a defense industry or a industrial military complex is not necessarily that easy, especially if you have a country who's joining the West and the West is trying to deindustrialize. So everything is downscaled already, and you let the Chinese do everything and that sort of stuff. It didn't fit into the overall economic development and this, that, and the other thing. And this is where we are today, not just in the Ukraine, but also in countries like in Germany and in the United States here and in England and in France and in Sweden and in other countries, is with the national economies kind of dissolving into this global thing. You don't really have one country left anymore which can make any of these weapon systems completely on their own, or in only very limited quantities, not enough to actually run a war against a nation, say like the Russian Federation in this case. And this is where our political leadership here in the United States, on both sides, the Republicans as bad as the Democrats, have slept through this whole thing. And the West has still not adopted yet to the new style of warfare we're looking at with the drones. But back to the missile systems. So now President Zelensky had asserted he wanted to get certain short mid-range missile systems from the West in order to attack military targets and depots, munition, supply line routes and stuff like this in Russia. And that is probably not going to work because of how I explained that in my other video some time ago, because of the technology and the involvement of the command centers of the national military, commands to get these systems actually to fire and take off and all of that stuff. So this is the big question. The other thing is, what I have wondered, and I addressed that earlier, with the whole draft situation in the Ukraine. Now, I understand the Ukraine better now because I'm following primarily two channels. One is the lady named Vita. She is a teacher in Kiev, and she has some house in the country out there, a dacha basically. And the other one is Pavlo from Ukraine, and then of course Operator Starsky. That's the three. And then there's another fellow, I forgot his name now, who's a retired pilot, or a pilot out of work because he can fly. There's no civil aviation, so to speak, at this point. So that is kind of these channels I'm following. And the most interesting one is Pavlo, and it is Vita, in that sense that they're actually showing video footage from Kiev. And what I realized in these videos is, especially with Pavlo, when he did a live stream on a couple of occasions, is on how much certain parts of Kiev look like New York City. And the first thing which came into my mind here was Bloomberg. Bloomberg was the mayor of New York for a while there, and he transformed the city in that sense that he created these parks, and we got all these fancy high-rises and all of this stuff. And these people, like Bloomberg, they're very removed from any form of reality. I'm not quite sure exactly where that comes from, if that is because of their political belief system they have, or if they are just not capable of thinking the way normal people or practical people do, or engineers do, who have to solve everyday problems one way or the other way, in whatever situation you may have, to come up with a solution fairly quickly. Anyway, Bloomberg is one of those, and you can see on how this whole city planning, the political structure, has shaped already Kiev. That must have happened right there after that Orange Revolution, the Maiden Revolution, and they came then in, and then the Democrats, and we know this whole story with Biden and his son, who was supposed to have done this, that, and the other thing, whatever. I don't want to get into these parts. But there's a lot of activity going on. But in the end, these people did not counsel or consult properly with the elected officials in the Ukraine. This is where our responsibility really lies. And I would have advised them, looking at the situation in the Donbass at that point already, and the situation in Crimea, was that they probably should have started a lot earlier with a lot more force and a lot more money to start building up a defense industry, a industrial military complex, so to speak, a Ukrainian industrial military complex. Bloomberg and these people, especially the Democrats and the Republicans, they're not necessarily the greatest friends of this kind of stuff, because they are globalists. So in the globalist strategy, national economies and national defense does not correlate. They cannot process that intellectually on how these things interrelate. So you get some really weird and bizarre stuff. And this is what we're seeing here in the Ukraine, basically playing out with the heavy dependence of the Ukraine upon the Western military complexes to produce weapons in a wide variety for them, because they never established that in the first place. As a nation, now I'm going to sound almost like Donald Trump, you need to have borders and you need to have a national economy. And part of a national economy is that you, first of all, can make all of the stuff what the nation actually needs, preferably with your own resources, if you're fortunate enough. Or you have to import this from allies, then, whether it's coal, whether it's iron, whether it's aluminum, whether it's copper, any type of raw materials you may need, oil, you name it. If you don't have it, then you're dependent upon other nations to basically aid you with this. The Soviet Union and today the Russian Federation can supply their own needs and far beyond of what they need. So, again, the Russian Federation, and that's what they are doing, is they're reestablishing, they're putting their industrial military complex, they're taking it out of that sleeping Dornröschen state, and they're transforming it back into a very mighty military machine, industrial military complex. This is what we're seeing. Whereas the Ukraine at this point is pretty much lacking all of it. And of course it is easier to establish this during the peacetime than it is to trying to do this during the wartime. And interestingly enough is Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, when they came to power in 1932-33, did exactly that. They started to reestablish and rebuild the industrial military complex from the Versailles Treaty to recover from that, and they built up the Wehrmacht. However, that was a long undertaking, And they were technically not ready in material and manpower in 1939 to actually go ahead and engage in these wars, which they did engage in. And of course, once you experience some success, the reality kind of goes out. And this is what happened to them. And thankfully it did happen, because this is how we got rid of these people in the first place. And we're going to see if the West believes that we're going to be able to cause a uprising in the Russian Federation against Putin. I don't think that this is going to happen. I said that before. A change of leadership will not be the result out of this. At this point, the focus has to shift on a wartime, during wartime with limited resources, their own weapons program, especially if it comes to missiles. And I hope that President Zelensky can succeed with this. There should be enough human resources in the Ukraine, from engineering, science, and other areas, and machinists who should be able, based on their past experience with a long break in it, to reproduce these weapons. Tupolev was involved to quite an extent, far beyond what the West actually knows, in the old missile system, what the Soviet Union had at that time. And they should be able to recapture some of this and restart this on a larger scale. And like I said, you can actually do this close to the borders, and probably you have to do it underground. You may have to borrow there from the Nazis, the way they did this, with this kind of a production. Of course, not with forced labor, the way they did it. We hope not. But this is basically the strategy. That will be a big part. I contributed to Vita. She solicited some money to buy and build drones. So she built 5 or 10 drones. So I think I sponsored 1 or 2 of these drones, if I'm not mistaken, on a small basis. But the drone stuff is okay. It's very important, and it's very admirable, the strategy of what the Ukrainian military there has developed in utilizing that technology to the extent and the efficiency they have in it. But this, for the turning point, to create a real turning point in this war for the Ukraine, is by far not sufficient enough. And they will have to build their own missile projects, their own missile system, and their own industry behind it. That is so nationally difficult, to do already here, even when it gets between Europe and the United States with these systems. That is something you have to have. If you want a nation, then you have to get your own stuff going. The only exception might be Israel, but even they got their own stuff going. And of course, the best example for that is North Korea, to the extent they went. And there's a lot to be learned. We can disagree with this. And yes, there's human rights violations and this, that, and the other thing. And none of it is democratic. But in the end, they got it established. And it is very difficult to take these people out because of it. So we hope for the best. We're prepared for the worst. And we hope that they're going to win. And with that, you're going to have a good evening.